The grand halls of the Stellaris Empire's royal palace lay draped in a silence far denser than the vacuum of space itself. Once buzzing with the energy of diplomats, scholars, and warriors from countless star systems, now it pulsed with an anxious, quiet hum. Word had spread like wildfire across the empire. Queen Lyria, the revered and nearly mythical Galactic queen, had been struck by an illness. Not just any illness, this was something terrifyingly foreign, a sickness that had reduced her to a shadow of her former self. Lyria was no ordinary ruler. Her existence itself was shrouded in mystery, stories of her rule spanning centuries, with whispers that she was as timeless as the stars. To those who served her, she was not merely a queen, she was a symbol of wisdom, power, and eternal protection. Her very presence had always felt immortal, and yet here she was, vulnerable, pale, and in pain. No one dared voice it aloud, but fear rippled through the hearts of her subjects. If Queen Lyria could fall, what was left to protect them? Within her private chambers, the heart of her empire had been transformed into a sterile, hospital-like environment. Lyria lay in her chamber, surrounded by medical apparatus from worlds so far-flung and advanced they didn't even have names, only coordinates. Alien scientists, healers from galaxies beyond mortal comprehension, and the Empire's finest physicians had come, tried, and failed. The mysterious disease defied every known remedy. It crept through her body with a cruel, slow deliberation, as if it were mocking the galaxy's most advanced minds. For the first time in eons, Lyria felt mortal, tethered to the very fragility she had thought herself beyond. In a final act of desperation, her advisors broadcast a call for help to every corner of the cosmos, appealing to the medical savants of countless worlds. Many came: doctors, herbalists, healers, each bearing different knowledge, technologies, and theories. But none could stop the spread of the illness, nor alleviate the debilitating weakness that was taking hold of her. And then, when all hope seemed lost, a human doctor from a relatively insignificant blue-green planet answered the call. Dr. Mark Bennett was an unassuming figure by galactic standards, a doctor of limited renown in the vast tapestry of the universe. Humanity's medical technology, though admirable in its earnest attempts, was considered rudimentary at best, and Mark's arrival was met with a heavy skepticism. But he had a tenacity that knew no bounds, and a heart as compassionate as any healer Lyria had ever encountered. The Queen's advisors were dubious, some outright disdainful, yet Lyria, in a moment of clarity amidst her fevered delirium, allowed him entry to her chamber. She saw something in him: a gentle resilience, a quiet strength. While others had arrived armed with gadgets and equipment, Mark arrived with a worn leather satchel, his own knowledge, and a profound determination to try, even if it meant failure. Mark's first days in the palace were spent in quiet study, poring over samples, observing the Queen from afar, and meticulously recording the symptoms that had eluded some of the galaxy's brightest minds. He was a man of habit, ritual, and patience. Each night he would read through the gathered research, studying alien case studies that dwarfed Earth's wildest scientific theories. And each day he would return to Lyria's chamber with a humble assurance that he would do everything within his power to ease her suffering. At first, his approach baffled and frustrated Lyria's advisors, who demanded that he wield some magic cure, some miracle serum. But Mark was not a man of miracles, he was a man of small, careful steps. And it was through these steps that he began to notice things others had missed. For days, Mark immersed himself in a blend of Earth's ancient healing practices and galactic herbal knowledge, combining them in ways no one else had thought to try. His process was both deeply scientific and quietly intuitive. He drew on Earth's old herbal remedies and practices, something he'd studied as a young doctor, and which he believed could work in tandem with the advanced science at his disposal. Alien physicians scoffed at his simplicity, but Lyria's advisors, desperate and out of options, allowed him to proceed. Lyria, for her part, watched him through half-lidded eyes. Even in her weakened state, her gaze was sharp, assessing. She'd been alive for countless years, yet there was something refreshingly unpredictable about this human. She'd seen courage, loyalty, and brilliance, but Mark's stubborn, unyielding persistence was unique. He did not look at her as a deity or a ruler, he looked at her with genuine concern, as a doctor would a patient in need. Weeks passed, and Mark's efforts began to bear fruit. It was subtle at first, the faintest touch of color returning to Lyria's cheeks, a slight lessening of the fever that had held her captive. Every day he checked her pulse with an attentiveness that spoke of more than just duty. He watched over her with a patience and care that surprised even Lyria herself. She wasn't used to this kind of tender attention. She, who had commanded armies and worlds, was being treated as though she were fragile and valuable in a way that was both comforting and strangely unsettling. Under Mark's care, Lyria's condition began to stabilize. Her breathing grew less labored, her sleep less feverish, and the once pervasive coldness that had seeped into her bones started to recede. The progress was slow, agonizingly so, but it was real. For the first time in weeks, Lyria dared to believe she might survive this ordeal. But as she grew stronger, another realization dawned upon her: she was not alone. She had never truly felt that kind of companionship before. Lyria had surrounded herself with advisors and allies, yes, but Mark's presence was different. He was there not out of obligation or duty, but out of an earnest desire to help, driven by his own quiet determination to see her well. One evening, as Mark was tending to her, Lyria found herself speaking a simple question, almost absurdly so for someone of her stature. "Why did you come here?" Her voice was weak, but her gaze was piercing, holding him in place, as though she could unravel him with her stare. Mark looked up, startled. He'd never been addressed by her in such a direct manner. He paused, considering his answer carefully. "Because I wanted to help," he replied simply. "You needed someone, and sometimes the most improbable answer is the right one." Something softened in Lyria then. She'd heard countless declarations of loyalty and devotion, yet this unadorned answer was perhaps the most sincere of them all. She closed her eyes, resting back as Mark continued his work. And for the first time since her illness began, a strange sense of peace washed over her. As the days passed, the palace atmosphere shifted. The quiet hum of tension faded, replaced by cautious optimism. The queen was recovering, and it was thanks to this unexpected, unassuming human. He had achieved what the most brilliant minds of the galaxy could not. Mark was no longer regarded with skepticism but with a quiet reverence, as palace servants and advisors alike began to realize the true depth of his skill. Despite his success, Mark was humble, refusing any recognition beyond the satisfaction of seeing Lyria's strength return. He remained close, dutifully tending to her as she healed, ever watchful, his presence a calming balm. For Lyria, her gradual recovery was accompanied by a new awareness, a burgeoning appreciation not only for her life but for the man who had given it back to her. A human, a being from a world so removed from the advanced complexities of her empire, had saved her. As she watched him work, his dedication unwavering, a curiosity stirred within her heart, one she hadn't felt in centuries. She found herself wanting to know more about this man, to understand the kindness and strength that had brought him to her side. Unbeknownst to either of them, the seeds of something profound had taken root. In the quiet hours, as Mark cared for her with a gentleness she hadn't known in eons, Lyria's gratitude began to transform, blossoming into an interest, a warmth that went beyond the boundaries of queen and healer. It was a warmth that, in time, would come to change them both, and eventually, the entire Stellaris Empire itself. The days passed in a delicate rhythm within Queen Lyria's recovery chamber, each sunrise marking a quiet victory over the illness that had nearly claimed her life. The once debilitating sickness no longer held her in its icy grip, and her body, though fragile, was slowly beginning to reclaim its former strength. But in the long hours of healing, a new vulnerability took root, one that went far deeper than the physical scars left by her illness. It was a vulnerability she had not anticipated, one that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the figure who sat at her bedside, day after day, tending to her with a calm, unbreakable resolve. Dr. Mark Bennett had become a constant presence, a guardian figure who seemed to understand her needs even before she did. He was there in the quiet mornings when she opened her eyes, the first figure she saw, steady and focused. He was there as night fell, his silhouette softened by the glow of monitors and the flickering lights of alien machinery, always vigilant, always close. His presence was gentle yet undeniable, an anchor that kept her tethered to the world when the isolation of her condition threatened to pull her under. Yet, as she healed, the nature of their relationship began to change in ways Lyria could hardly understand. She had ruled over empires, seen worlds crumble and reborn, But Mark's care and quiet devotion touched something within her that all her years of life had not prepared her for. At first, she thought it was simply the comfort of companionship, the relief of having someone nearby after so long a period of isolation. But it was more than that. She felt it in the way her eyes lingered on him, watching his careful movements as he adjusted her blankets, checked her vitals, or prepared yet another herbal remedy in his methodical, attentive way. Mark was more than her healer. He was a man who saw her, not as a ruler, not as a near mythical being, but as a person, someone in need of care, comfort, and understanding. And for Lyria, who had spent centuries armored by her status and power, this quiet recognition was both terrifying and exhilarating. In the beginning, their conversations were sparse, marked by the formality befitting a queen and her subject. Mark was respectful, almost reverent, never once crossing the invisible line that separated them. But as her health improved, so too did their exchanges. She began to ask him questions, probing gently at first, as if testing the waters of this new dynamic that was unfolding between them. "Tell me about Earth," she asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the question itself could disrupt the quiet intimacy of the room. "I've read reports, studied records, but they only show data, statistics, numbers. I want to know what it feels like." Mark looked at her, surprise flickering across his face before softening into a thoughtful smile. "Earth," he murmured, as though conjuring up memories from a place that felt both near and distant. "It's a beautiful contradiction. It can be harsh and unforgiving, but it's also resilient. The people there, they survive not because they're the strongest or the most advanced, but because they know how to adapt, to find beauty in small things. Life on Earth is different." The way he spoke of his home world painted a picture for Lyria that was far more vivid than any record she'd ever read. She could almost see it, a world of vast oceans, dense forests, simple lives filled with quiet moments and humble joys. It was a world so unlike her own, and yet, through Mark's words, it felt achingly familiar, as if she were glimpsing a part of herself she had long forgotten. As days turned into weeks, their conversations grew longer, delving into realms she'd once considered mundane but now found herself craving. Mark told her stories of his childhood on Earth, of the dusty streets of his hometown, of sunsets over the oceans that sparkled like liquid fire. He spoke of his family, friends, and the struggles he had faced as a doctor, of the lives he'd saved and those he hadn't, the ones that haunted him still. He spoke with an honesty that was both disarming and comforting, as if he'd shed any pretense or formality in her presence, sharing pieces of himself without hesitation. In return, Lyria began to share her own stories, though hers were grand and sprawling tales of ancient wars and intergalactic treaties, of empires won and lost. Yet, as she spoke, she found herself revealing more than she'd intended. She spoke of the loneliness of leadership, of the sacrifices she'd made, the relationships she'd let fade, all in the pursuit of power and peace for her people. She had been a queen for so long, her life defined by duty and unyielding strength, that she had forgotten what it meant to be simple herself. Mark listened with the kind of patience and empathy that seemed to come naturally to him, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding that made her feel both vulnerable and safe. He asked questions, not out of curiosity, but out of a genuine desire to understand her, not as a ruler, but as a person. One evening, as the soft glow of the palace lights bathed her room in an ethereal shimmer, Mark brought her a small, delicate plant from one of Earth's lush forests. It was modest by galactic standards, with slender, green leaves and a few shy blossoms. "This is lavender," he explained, his voice gentle. "On Earth, it's known for its calming effects. It helps with sleep, with healing. I thought it might bring you a little comfort." Lyria took the plant in her hands, its simple beauty stirring something deep within her. She lifted it to her face, breathing in its gentle scent, and felt a sense of peace wash over her, a peace she hadn't felt in centuries. It was a small gesture, yet it meant more to her than Mark could have known. In the quiet hours of the night, she found herself lying awake, her thoughts lingering on him in a way that was unfamiliar, even unsettling. She couldn't deny the warmth that his presence brought, the ease with which he seemed to see through her defenses, his kindness unraveling the layers she had carefully constructed around herself over centuries. She had never allowed herself to be so vulnerable, so unguarded, but with Mark, it felt almost natural, as if this connection between them had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Their companionship grew into an unspoken bond, a shared understanding that transcended words. And as Lyria's health continued to improve, she realized with a pang that one day Mark would return to Earth, leaving her to resume the life she had known before. The thought left her with a strange, hollow ache, one that she could neither name nor ignore. Yet, the more time they spent together, the more she began to wonder if there might be a way to keep him by her side, not as her healer, but as a friend, perhaps even something more. But such thoughts were dangerous, and she pushed them aside, clinging to the moments they shared instead, each one a treasure she held close to her heart. One day, as Mark was adjusting a bandage on her wrist, his fingers brushing against her skin with the gentlest of touches, she looked at him, her gaze steady. "Mark," she began softly, her voice tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to express before. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Not just for saving my life, but for being here, for seeing me as more than a ruler." She hesitated, then continued, her words barely above a whisper. "Tell me, is there anything you desire? A reward, a gift, something I can give you in return for all you've done?" Mark looked up, his expression thoughtful, his eyes warm as they met hers. He shook his head slightly, his mouth curving into a gentle smile. "There's no need for that, Your Majesty. I didn't come here for a reward. I came to help, because I couldn't stand by knowing there was someone in need." But as he looked at her, something flickered in his gaze, a quiet longing that he hadn't dared to voice until that moment. Although he said, almost hesitantly, "If I could ask for one thing, it would be time. Time to know you better, not as a queen but as Lyria, the person behind the crown." The simplicity of his wish left her breathless. She had expected grand requests, demands for wealth, power, or influence. But Mark's desire was as humble and genuine as the man himself, a wish born of sincerity, not ambition. He simply wanted to know her, to understand her beyond the titles and the regalia. "Time," she echoed softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. For the first time, the idea of granting a wish felt like a gift not for him, but for herself. She could see the openness in his expression, the quiet hope that she would say yes, and in that moment she knew that this simple request was more precious than any jewel or title she could offer. With a nod, she granted his wish, and as their gazes locked, an unspoken promise passed between them, a promise of companionship, of trust, of something deeper that neither dared to name. The palace had taken on a strange new rhythm, a quieter, more intimate pulse that only two souls shared. For all the grandeur of the Stellaris Empire, its vast halls and glittering corridors, a single wish had transformed the world within those walls, shifting the center of its universe. Queen Lyria's recovery was no longer a solitary journey, it was one she now shared with Mark Bennett, her humble yet remarkable human healer. Mark's wish had been simple: to spend more time with Lyria, to understand her beyond the authority she wielded and the titles she bore. And she, in turn, found herself intrigued, drawn by a desire as strange and ancient as she was. The boundaries that had once kept her aloof and distant now felt irrelevant, as if they belonged to a different person, a different life. In the mornings, they would walk through the palace gardens, an ethereal sanctuary teeming with flora from countless worlds. The plants ranged from majestic trees with silver leaves that shimmered in the sun to delicate blooms that glowed faintly in the shade, exuding subtle fragrances that shifted with the breeze. For Lyria, these gardens had been a symbol of her empire's greatness, a collection of the rarest, most exotic specimens in the galaxy. But Mark's presence transformed them into something different, something simpler and more precious. It was here, under the vast alien sky, that she first felt the weight of her crown slip away, replaced by the quiet joy of simply being. They walked side by side, neither ruler nor subject, but two individuals bound by an invisible thread. As they strolled, Mark would sometimes reach out to gently touch a leaf or a petal, his fingers brushing the delicate life that surrounded them with the same reverence he'd shown her. Lyria found herself watching him more closely than she ever had before, noticing the small details, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the warmth that lit his eyes when he looked at her, the quiet confidence in his stride that reminded her of Earth's mountains, solid and unwavering. One morning, As they wandered through a grove of trees that whispered with an ancient alien language, Mark finally spoke, his voice soft yet filled with curiosity. What was it like, he asked, glancing at her. To become a queen, to take on the responsibility of all of this. Lyria paused, the question catching her off guard. It had been centuries since anyone had asked her about her beginnings, let alone expressed such genuine interest. But Mark's eyes held no expectation, only a gentle patience that seemed to invite her to share without judgment. When I was younger, she began slowly, her gaze drifting over the treetops. I never wanted the throne. My dreams were simpler. I wanted to study the stars, to be free to explore the cosmos without the burden of an empire. She smiled faintly, a hint of nostalgia coloring her expression. But the empire needed a ruler, and my path was chosen for me. I didn't resist. I accepted my duty, and over time it became who I was. It became everything. Mark nodded, listening in silence as she continued. There were wars, she said, her voice carrying a distant, almost haunted tone. Decisions that haunted me. Lives lost, all in the name of stability, of order. I had to become someone unbreakable, someone who could carry the weight of billions without hesitation. And somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was before the crown. I became a symbol, a figurehead. And the world forgot that there was ever a person beneath the title. Her words hung in the air, laden with the weight of unspoken years. She looked at Mark, expecting to see pity or sympathy, but his expression was one of quiet understanding. Do you miss it? He asked gently. That freedom? The chance to be just Lyria. She felt a strange pang in her chest, a sense of longing she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. I didn't, not until recently. It's easy to forget, to lose oneself in duty. But since you came, since we've talked, yes, I think I do miss it. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Lyria felt a sense of relief, a strange lightness in finally speaking of the burdens she'd carried alone for so long. And Mark, for his part, seemed content to let her words settle, never pushing, never prodding, simply walking beside her, as if his presence alone was enough to ease her heart. Their companionship deepened with each passing day, filling the spaces between them with a warmth that felt as real and tangible as the alien blooms surrounding them. Mark's sincerity, his gentle curiosity, and his unwavering kindness became a balm to her spirit. She found herself laughing with him, something she hadn't done in ages, soft, genuine laughter that felt like a release, like a part of herself was returning after centuries of dormancy. And in return, she began to learn more about Mark, his life back on Earth, his struggles and triumphs. He spoke of his years in medical school, of long nights spent studying by candlelight when the electricity failed in his modest apartment. He told her about the first patient he lost, a child whose face he still saw in dreams, and the helplessness that nearly drove him from his calling. He shared stories of his family, of the mother he still missed, and the sister who had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. One evening, as they sat beneath the galaxy's twin moons, Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful. You know, I always thought I'd be ordinary, he said quietly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Just another doctor in a small town, doing my best to help people. I never imagined I'd end up here, in a palace among the stars, healing a queen. He glanced at her, a hint of wonder in his gaze. And yet this feels right, like this is where I was meant to be. Lyria's heart swelled at his words, at the quiet honesty in his voice. She had never heard anyone speak so openly, so vulnerably, and she realized then that Mark had given her a gift beyond healing. He had given her a sense of humanity, a reminder of the simple, unguarded connections she had sacrificed long ago in her quest for power and stability. As days turned into weeks, Mark's wish, the simple wish for time, became a cherished ritual, a sanctuary of shared moments that only they could understand. And slowly, subtly, Lyria found herself feeling things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in centuries. One afternoon, they were sitting by a crystalline lake on the palace grounds, the water reflecting the sky's pink and violet hues. Lyria was telling him about a distant world where the seas glowed with bioluminescent creatures, casting an eternal twilight over the landscape. Mark listened, his face alight with fascination. "I'd love to see that someday," he said, leaning back with a wistful sigh. "There's so much out there, so many worlds, and I never thought I'd be able to see any of it." Lyria studied him for a moment, a spark of an idea taking shape. "Perhaps one day you will. The galaxy is vast, but it is also open to those with the courage to explore it." He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Do you mean that?" She nodded, feeling a strange thrill at the thought. "You've shown me so much, Mark. It only seems fair to return the favor." Their gazes met, and in that moment, there was no queen, no healer, only two souls bound by an unspoken understanding. She wanted to tell him that he had healed her in ways he could never understand, that his presence had restored not just her body but a part of her spirit she thought had been lost forever. But the words felt too heavy, too close to something she wasn't ready to admit. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, but electric, a spark that lingered between them long after she withdrew her hand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the lake, Mark turned to her, his voice filled with a gentle reverence. "Thank you, Lyria," he murmured, his words barely audible. "Thank you for letting me see this side of you, for letting me be here." She looked at him, her heart racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions she could no longer ignore. She had once been a woman who ruled empires, who wielded power with an iron hand. But now, in the presence of this humble human, she felt something far greater, something raw, vulnerable, and undeniably real. In granting Mark his simple wish for time, she had opened a door she could no longer close, a door that led to a part of herself she hadn't known still existed. And in the soft silence of the twilight, beneath a sky filled with stars that stretched across galaxies, Lyria understood that her life would never be the same again. The universe stretched endlessly before them, a dark canvas scattered with brilliant pinpricks of light, stars flickering across galaxies in a tapestry of wonder. For centuries, Lyria had traveled this vast expanse as a queen, a ruler bound by duty and diplomacy, her journeys dictated by the needs of her empire. But today was different. Today she was not traveling as a monarch, but as herself, bound not for a distant planet of high political stakes, but to Earth, the home world of the man who had saved her life. Mark's second wish had been simple, yet monumental. He had asked to show her his world, to share with her the sights, sounds, and spirit of Earth. It was a humble wish, one that came without grandeur or ambition. But to Lyria, it felt like a pilgrimage, a chance to glimpse a piece of the universe she had only known through cold records and impersonal reports. And so she had arranged the journey in secret, her advisors and guards sworn to silence, leaving behind her titles and the weight of her crown, at least for a few precious days. As they approached Earth, Mark's excitement was palpable, a quiet thrill that transformed his usually calm demeanor into something vibrant, almost boyish. He gazed out of the viewing window with an expression Lyria had never seen on him before, an unguarded joy that made her heart swell with warmth. "There it is," he whispered, more to himself than to her, his eyes fixed on the blue-green orb growing larger as they neared. Lyria felt her own anticipation stir as she gazed at the planet, its oceans and continents gleaming in the sunlight. Earth was small, almost delicate in the vastness of space, yet there was something enchanting about it, a sense of life and resilience that resonated deeply within her. She glanced at Mark, catching his eye, and he smiled, a smile that held the promise of stories yet untold. Their ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, slipping past clouds that seemed to part in welcome. They landed in a secluded area on the outskirts of Mark's hometown, a place shielded from prying eyes, a quiet pocket of nature where they could emerge unnoticed. Lyria had insisted on traveling discreetly, wearing a simple cloak that concealed her alien features, the glimmer of her regal attire replaced with something humble. She wanted this journey to be as unguarded as possible, a chance to walk among Mark's people without the barrier of her status. As they stepped out of the ship, the air hit her with a freshness she hadn't anticipated, a cool, earthy scent mingled with the crispness of pine trees and the faint tang of salt from a distant sea. It was so different from the sterile atmospheres of interstellar craft, so alive, that it felt almost like a shock to her senses. Mark led her through a winding path, his steps familiar and confident, his gaze warm with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "This forest," he explained, gesturing to the tall, ancient trees around them. "It's where I used to come as a kid. My sister and I would play here for hours, pretending we were explorers on some grand adventure." Lyria couldn't help but smile, her gaze drifting to the towering trees that seemed to watch over them like silent guardians. She could almost picture a young Mark running through these woods, his laughter ringing out as he imagined worlds beyond Earth's sky. It was a strangely intimate glimpse into his life, a piece of him that she felt honored to share. As they walked, Mark reached for her hand, guiding her over a small stream with a natural ease that surprised her. His touch was warm, grounding, and she felt a faint thrill at the simple, unceremonious way he led her through his world. She realized then that she had been missing something essential in her life, a connection to something real, something grounded in the ordinary beauty of existence. In her world of advanced technologies and grand titles, the simple act of walking hand in hand through a forest felt like a revelation. They emerged from the trees to find themselves standing on the edge of a wide, open field that sloped down to a small town nestled below. Lyria looked out over the scene, taking in the cozy rooftops, the winding roads, the faint outline of children playing in the distance. Everything felt both small and infinite, the world condensed yet brimming with life. Mark watched her, gauging her reaction. "It's nothing like your empire, I know," he said, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "But this is home." Lyria shook her head, her gaze soft. "It's beautiful, Mark. It's alive." They descended into the town, weaving through quiet streets and passing by rows of small, brightly painted houses. Mark pointed out landmarks from his childhood, the school he had attended, the bakery that made his favorite bread, the park where he'd learned to ride a bicycle. As he spoke, his voice filled with an affection that made Lyria feel as if she were stepping into his memories, seeing the world through his eyes. At one point, he stopped in front of a small, weathered building with a faded sign that read the blue orchid. Mark's face softened with a kind of nostalgic reverence. "This was where I had my first job," he said with a laugh. "I was a busboy here when I was 15. They paid me in tips and leftover pie slices. Not the most glamorous work, but I learned a lot here." Lyria smiled, imagining a younger Mark, humble and hardworking, learning the value of small, honest work. It was a world so far removed from her own that it felt almost surreal, yet she found herself charmed by its simplicity, by the unassuming beauty of the life he had led. As they continued their walk, Lyria noticed the glances people gave them, curious yet respectful. Mark was well known in his town, and he greeted everyone with a warm smile, a nod, sometimes a handshake. She could see the admiration in their eyes, the trust they placed in him. It was clear he was more than just a doctor to them. He was a pillar of the community, a steady presence who cared for their well-being as much as he did for her own. Eventually, Mark led her to a small, rocky path that wound down to the shore of a hidden cove. The beach was empty, a secluded stretch of sand cradled by towering cliffs, the waves crashing softly in a soothing rhythm. Lyria felt a pang of awe as she looked out over the ocean, a vast expanse of water that stretched to the horizon, its depths dark and mysterious. Mark sat down on the sand, and she joined him, feeling the cool grains beneath her fingers. The ocean breeze ruffled her hair, carrying with it the scent of salt and freedom, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully absorb the sensation. "This is my favorite place," Mark said softly, gazing out at the waves. "Whenever life felt too heavy, I'd come here. Something about the ocean, it reminds me that we're all just a small part of something much larger. It's humbling." Lyria opened her eyes, looking at him with a tenderness she could no longer hide. "Thank you for bringing me here, Mark. I've seen so many worlds, but I've never felt this." She gestured to the waves, to the sky, to the land that stretched out around them. This sense of connection. It's as if I'm part of something, not just above it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves lap at the shore, the sky changing hues as the sun began to set. Lyria felt a quiet peace settle within her, a feeling of belonging that she hadn't known she was capable of. In this moment, she was not a queen, not a ruler of an empire. She was simply Lyria, a woman sitting beside someone who had come to mean more to her than she could put into words. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the water, Mark reached into his bag, pulling out a small, worn notebook. He handed it to her, his expression warm yet uncertain. "These are memories. Thoughts I've written down over the years. I'd like you to have it if you want. It's nothing grand, just pieces of my life." But he trailed off, a hint of vulnerability in his gaze. Lyria took the notebook, her heart swelling at the gesture. She opened it, her fingers tracing over the inked words, sketches, notes, and reflections that filled the pages. It was a piece of him, a fragment of his world, offered freely and without reservation. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "This means more to me than you know." They stayed by the ocean until the stars emerged, a blanket of light stretching across the sky. Mark pointed out constellations, telling her stories of Earth's legends, myths, and ancient tales passed down through generations. She listened, enthralled, her heart aching with a longing she could no longer deny. She realized, in this quiet moment under the stars, that she had found something she had spent centuries searching for, something she hadn't known she needed until it was here, beside her. As the night deepened, Mark finally turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft starlight. "Thank you for coming with me, Lyria," he said, his voice filled with an honesty that pierced her soul. "I wanted you to see Earth, not just for what it is, but for what it represents to me. It's a place of resilience, of beauty that doesn't demand attention. I hoped it might show you that sometimes life is worth living not for the grandeur, but for the quiet moments like this." Lyria looked at him, her heart racing, a warmth spreading through her that felt like both freedom and surrender. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek in a gesture as tender as it was deliberate. "I understand, Mark," she murmured. "More than you know." In that moment, under the starlit sky, with the waves murmuring their eternal song, Lyria felt something shift within her, a recognition, a knowing, a love that defied the boundaries of her title, her empire, her very existence. She had granted Mark his wish to share his world, but he had given her something far greater in return, a reason to believe in the possibility of a life beyond duty, a life she had never dared to dream of. And as they sat together, two souls entwined by fate and choice, Lyria knew that her heart was forever bound to this place, this planet, and this man who had shown her the beauty of being seen, understood, and perhaps one day loved. The stars of Stellaris shone brighter than ever, casting an ethereal glow over Queen Lyria's palace, a quiet grandeur woven into the soft shadows that filled her chambers. But within the brilliance of her empire, Lyria's heart was restless. She had returned from Earth with memories that haunted her, each one a reminder of a life she had never imagined could be hers. Weeks had passed since that intimate journey with Mark, and every day her duties had resumed with the weight and authority she had once embraced without question. Council meetings, diplomatic crises, interstellar negotiations. She was the Galactic Queen, a woman whose very presence commanded galaxies. Yet beneath that facade, a new awareness pulsed, a quiet rebellion in her heart that Mark's presence had awakened. Mark had remained by her side, as steady as the sun rising over 1,000 worlds. Though his official duties as her healer had come to an end, he stayed on, assisting her advisors with health initiatives and quietly expanding his influence among the palace staff and the broader empire. But even as they settled back into their routines, an unspoken tension lingered between them, a question suspended in the silence of each shared glance and fleeting touch. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens under a canopy of alien flowers that shimmered with a silvery glow, Lyria felt the weight of their unspoken bond pressing down on her. She stopped beside a fountain, her gaze lost in the play of water that danced in the moonlight. Mark watched her, his expression open, sensing the turmoil within her. "What's on your mind, Lyria?" he asked gently, his voice a grounding presence in the stillness of the night. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her crown settle heavily upon her, not in the literal sense, but in the way her title had come to define her, to trap her in a life that felt both essential and suffocating. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took him by surprise. "I've given you 2 wishes, Mark," she began, her voice soft yet resolute, "and each one has brought me closer to a part of myself I thought I had lost. But now I wonder what you would wish for if you could ask for anything." She hesitated, her next words carrying a vulnerability she hadn't shown to anyone in centuries. "If you had one last wish, what would it be?" Mark's gaze softened, a tenderness flickering in his eyes. He reached out, his hand resting gently on hers, and the warmth of his touch seemed to melt the barriers she had built around herself. "Are you sure you want to know?" he asked quietly, his tone laced with a hint of fear and hope. She nodded, her heart pounding, each beat echoing with the inevitability of what she already suspected but needed to hear. Mark took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "My wish is simple, Lyria," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet, unwavering conviction. "I wish for you to find true happiness not as a queen, not as the ruler of Stellaris, but as yourself. I want you to experience life, not from a throne or behind walls, but as a person free to choose her own path, her own dreams." His words settled over her like a gentle storm, filling her with both longing and fear. For a moment she could see it, a life without the Empire's demands, a life lived on her terms, filled with ordinary beauty and quiet joys, shared with the man who had shown her that she was not merely a queen, but a woman deserving of happiness. But reality crashed back into her heart with brutal clarity. She was the Galactic Queen. She held power that spanned light years, the protector of countless worlds and billions of lives. How could she abandon her people, her duty, her entire existence for something as fragile and uncertain as personal happiness? She looked away, her gaze fixed on the fountain, the water's endless cycle a bitter reminder of the life she had been trapped in for centuries. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her decision. "Mark, I don't know how to be anything but this. My duty to the Empire is all I have ever known. Without it, I would be nothing." Mark's hand tightened around hers, his warmth anchoring her as she struggled with the tempest of emotions within her. "You are not nothing, Lyria," he said, his voice filled with a fierce compassion. "You are someone extraordinary, but you deserve to be happy, to live a life that is truly your own." His words struck something deep within her, a truth she had buried so far down that even she had forgotten it was there. She had given herself entirely to her empire, her people, her duty, never once stopping to ask if this life, this endless chain of responsibilities, was what she truly wanted. As the night wore on, Mark continued to hold her hand, a silent presence that refused to let her fall back into the safety of her old life. And in that quiet, something shifted within her, a realization that filled her with both terror and exhilaration. She could leave. She could walk away from it all, from the crown, the empire, the power that had both defined and imprisoned her. But leaving would mean more than simply walking away. It would mean facing the unknown, becoming someone new, someone vulnerable and open to a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. With a shuddering breath, she turned back to him, her heart racing. "If I leave," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I won't be Queen Lyria anymore. I'll be just a woman, and I don't know who that woman is. I don't know what it means to live a life for myself." Mark's eyes shone with quiet encouragement, his hand still holding hers with unwavering strength. "Then, let me show you, Lyria," he said softly. "Let us discover that life together." The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off the edge of a cliff into an endless sky. But as she looked into Mark's eyes, she knew that, for the first time, she was making a choice that was hers and hers alone. The following days were a blur of preparations, each one carefully orchestrated to ensure a smooth transition. She summoned her most trusted advisor, Orlin, a man she had known for centuries, whose loyalty and wisdom had been her foundation through countless crises. Orlin looked at her with disbelief when she explained her decision, his brow furrowing in concern. "My queen, this is unthinkable," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "The Empire needs you. You are the heart of Stellaris." Lyria placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "Orlin, you are more than capable of leading in my place. I trust you, as I have always trusted you. The Empire will endure, because it is more than just one person. It is the sum of all our people, of every world, every soul who calls Stellaris home." Orlin nodded, though a trace of sorrow lingered in his eyes. He could see that her mind was set, and he bowed deeply, accepting the mantle she was passing on with a gravity that honored her choice. And so on a quiet dawn, beneath a sky painted in the soft colors of a distant sunrise, Lyria and Mark prepared to leave the palace. Lyria wore a simple gown, the regalia of her queenship left behind, her hair unbound and her gaze clear, unburdened by the weight of her crown. Mark waited for her, his expression a mixture of joy and understanding, his presence a steady force that had carried her through this journey. They slipped through the palace gates and out into the open, leaving behind the grandeur of Stellaris for a new beginning. Lyria looked back once, a pang of bittersweet nostalgia tugging at her heart, but she felt no regret. She had given her life to her empire, and now she was taking a part of it back for herself. As they walked together side by side, she felt a lightness she had never known, a freedom that filled her with wonder and possibility. The world stretched out before her, vast and unknown, a blank canvas waiting for her to paint a new life. They traveled to distant planets, exploring worlds with wonder and curiosity, experiencing life in its raw, unfiltered form. Lyria tasted unfamiliar foods, walked through bustling marketplaces, and watched the sunrise over alien oceans. Each day was a revelation, each moment a gift, and with Mark by her side she felt more alive than she ever had within the walls of her palace. One evening, as they sat beneath a sky filled with twin moons, Mark looked at her, his gaze tender and open. "Are you happy, Lyria?" he asked, his voice soft, as if he already knew the answer. She smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth that felt like home. "Yes, Mark," she whispered, "I am." They held each other under the stars, their bodies pressed close, no longer healer and queen, but simply two souls bound by love, by choice, by the life they had chosen to build together. Lyria felt the weight of her old life fall away, replaced by a joy that was both fierce and fragile, a happiness that she knew she would cherish for the rest of her days. And as they lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lyria knew that she had found what she had been searching for all along, not power, not duty, but a life that was wholly and irrevocably her own.